Afternoon, and welcome to today's industry-presented webinar, Get Cultured on Fermented Dairy Foods. Today's webinar is presented by National Dairy Council. For those of you not familiar with National Dairy Council, NDC is a nonprofit organization founded in 1915 by dairy farmers because they believed in science and the importance of understanding how dairy foods may benefit human nutrition and health. Today, NDC represents about 40,000 dairy farm families across the U.S., as well as dairy importers. On behalf of America's dairy farmers, NDC's diverse team of scientists, registered dietitian nutritionists, and communication professionals strive to bring to life the dairy community's shared vision of a healthy, happy, sustainable world with science as the foundation. The U.S. dairy community believe in a world well-nourished and are committed to providing responsibly produced, nutritious dairy foods that help nourish people, strengthen communities, and foster a sustainable future. One continuing education credit, or CEC, courtesy of National Dairy Council, will be emailed to all participants after the webinar. You should receive the CEC email and a link to the presentation within the next 1 to 2 days. There is no need to email ACSM asking about CEC credit. Perhaps it is a combination of their unique taste profile, artisanal aura, and health benefits that has secured fermented foods a top spot with trend spotters across the globe. In today's webinar, Dr. Chris Cifelli and Chef Andrew Dole explain the nuances between fermented foods and probiotics. You will also hear about emerging evidence on yogurt's role in reducing inflammation, as well as explore how the unique matrix of fermented dairy foods may be associated with reduced risk of chronic diseases. Dr. Chris Cifelli oversees the Dairy and Public Health Research Platform for National Dairy Council. In his role, he leads NDC's research on chronic disease risk, childhood nutrition, NHNAES-related research, and nutrition and sustainability. Dr. Cifelli currently serves as the chair of the Science and Translation Committee for the International Scientific Association for Probiotics and Prebiotics, and is on the board of directors for the Yogurt and Nutrition Initiative. In addition, he has authored or co-authored more than 20 peer-reviewed research manuscripts, reviews, and abstracts. Andrew Dole is the owner of Body Fuel SPN, a sport performance and lifestyle nutrition practice in Castle Rock, Colorado, specializing in endurance athletes and weight management. A certified executive chef, an active triathlete and triathlon coach, Andrew manages clients around the world, combining nutrition science, behavior modification, and culinary expertise into nutrition interventions or sport performance-driven plans. Andrew is a published sports dietitian on the topic of exercise-associated muscle cramping and works with a variety of corporate clients, cities, and programs. He currently serves as an NDC ambassador. Andrew has also taught culinary and nutrition at the college level for over 9 years. It is with great pleasure that we present to you Andrew Dole.
Well, hey everyone, I'm Andrew Dole. I'm one of your webinar hosts today with Chris, the dark, handsome guy up there. And I'm glad you joined us to get cultured on fermented foods. This is a really fun webinar series, and it's the third in the Dairy Nourishes Life series from the National Dairy Council. This quarterly series addresses a range of topics related to dairy's role in health and sustainable food systems to help practitioners like you and I, as a dietitian, navigate the evolving health and wellness landscape and answer questions that you might have on this particular hot topic. Already introduced to you was Chris, PhD and Vice President of the Nutrition Research at the National Dairy Council, and myself with the alphabet soup, just trying to make up the PhD envy that I have for the smart guy up there as a dietitian and a certified executive chef. So let's talk today about fermented foods. What's old is new again. Like all great things that go away, they always seem to come back. And while fermented foods have not necessarily disappeared from our radar, they are a hot topic right now. And in the past, fermentation was used as a practice to preserve food, produce alcohol. And as you can see in the illustration, it's been around for a really long time, about over 10,000 years. It plays a huge role in our cultures around the globe then and now. So let's take a few foods. Let's take a look in the Americas that you may or may not be familiar with, just to get an idea of where fermentation has been. I think the Hawaiian poi is pretty familiar when it's made from taro. I think we hear about that one quite a bit. The garapos from Colombia and the champús are alcoholic beverages, which is no big, well, it's alcohol based. Wine and beer, anybody? Like all the mixologists, fermentation is something we're incredibly familiar with. Clearly, the Asian culture, it's incredibly important as well. I think these are probably, other than beer and wine, some of the most familiar ferments. The natto from Japan, miso, tempeh, kimchi from Korea, and the Indian lassi, which is just really yummy. I think if you think of a thick, creamy yogurt smoothie with spices and fruit, that's the Indian lassi all the way. The African ferments, I am less familiar with, but very interested in trying. Chris, I have had injera bread, but not any of the others. Have you had the pleasure of enjoying any of these?
I have not had the pleasure of enjoying these, but seeing the pictures, they do look quite delicious.
Yeah, they're really interesting. The Ethiopian ayib, that Ethiopian cottage cheese, looks something like I'd really like to try. I'd be really interested, those of you who are listening, if you have tried any of these, type in your comments and what you thought about them. I'd actually like to read them after we're done. I'd be really curious. And then Europe, last but not least, as I bounce around on the yogurt. Hold on, I'll find it. There we go, yogurt. We see these in our local grocery store, skyr, kefir, sauerkraut. I think these are also extremely familiar ferments, but they're a little bit different in the fermented version than what we see in the store. And that is something we are absolutely going to talk about. The history of yogurt. All right, trace back 10,000 to 5,000 BC. We're talking Neolithic period here. And herdsmen were carrying around milk in goatskin bags, and based upon the heat and the bouncing around, we came to the miraculous tangy yogurt custard. It's how it came about, and it's still with us. So fermentation has a really rich history, as you can see by the timeline. And I found something for the last time, Chris, that we did this, and you may or may not remember, but did you know that in 1768, Captain Cook earned a medal for feeding his sailors on his ship sauerkraut? And it wasn't limes that saved the day for scurvy. It was the vitamin C created through the fermentation process for the barrels of sauerkraut.
I had not known that till you brought it up the last time, and I now remember that fact. And I'm waiting for that to come up in a trivia night.
So you'll make millions, and you got to give me
exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So fermentation's been around for a really long time, and that alludes to some of the processes of fermentation changing the characteristics of the food that we're adding in as the original product. So today we're taking a look at yogurt, fermented foods, topping trend list, and one of my favorite sites, Today's Dietitian, did a What's Trending in Nutrition poll and surveyed over 1,300 registered dietitians like myself, and found that fermented foods topped the superfoods list for 2019. Some of that reason they cited was because of the benefits due to boosting gut health and potentially blunting inflammation, which a lot of you have heard the contrary. And we have Chris here that's going to talk about the science and allude to some of the answers on that. In about 5 slides, I'm going to hand it over to Chris, and we are going to uncover and translate some of that research. Fermented foods. I lost control of the slides. I can't advance that one. If you can advance it, that'd be great to the next one. So while we're waiting for the slides to advance here, we're going to talk about what fermented foods are. And simply put, fermented foods are made by extensive microbial growth. And yogurt happens to be a perfect example of what happens when we add cultures that creates lactic acid producing bacteria, or the yogurt starter cultures, and it's added to milk. That fermentation process, or the starter cultures, they grow on the sugars and the other nutrients in the milk, and they create yogurt. The same process happens with all fermented food, but what's different depends on the type of bacteria, the yeast, or the molds that are carrying out that fermentation. And a really important note here is that some fermented foods like kefir and some cheeses, the microbes are still alive. However, in other foods like sourdough or fresh cheeses, including cottage cheese, the microbes are destroyed. And we're going to talk about those important differences in here in just 1 second. You could advance that slide forward for me, it'd be great. We're going to watch a quick video here. So a lot of times the high level information is great, but it's sometimes KISS, keep it simple. And I want to share this great video that NDC partnered on with Discovery Ed, and it incorporates fermented foods into the STEM education system for 5th and 8th graders, and it has a great overview.
When milk leaves the farm, it can be turned into lots of different dairy foods with the help of science. Cow's milk can be used to make cheese and yogurt through the process of fermentation. Let's check it out. First, the milk is pasteurized, meaning it's heated up to kill any harmful bacteria. Then the good bacteria, yes, bacteria can be good, are added to turn milk into different foods. When different types of bacteria are added to milk, they can make milk thicker and tart, like yogurt, or into a savory cheese. Fermentation is a reaction caused by the helpful bacteria we add to milk. The added bacteria break down milk compounds and make an entirely new dairy food. The process of fermentation is just one way milk is used to make a variety of foods on our tables, starting on the farm with some help from science to get to our tables.
As these fermented foods enter the spotlight, it's really important to note that confusion behind what a fermented food and a probiotic is very easy. In this slide, we're going to kind of differentiate between the two. Fermented foods are made with microorganisms, absolutely. They may or may not contain live active cultures at a level to confer a health benefit. Now, in that one sentence is some critical information. Live active cultures at a level to confer a health benefit. So look at the probiotics subtitle now, right? The FAO definition of probiotics are live microorganisms that when administered in adequate amounts confer a health benefit. Yogurt is one of those considered a probiotic because the traditional cultures that created that yogurt have been well studied in their ability to help lactose digestion. So now we have organisms that have and can infer a health benefit. That would be a probiotic. That differentiates from just a regular fermented food. Now, how do we know if we have the cultures in our foods? With yogurt, there's a seal called the live active culture seal, a totally voluntary seal that indicates a significant amount of this good bacteria still remains in the end product when the fermentation is complete. Now, Chris and I have talked about this quite a bit. Before we did the last webinar, I myself as a dietitian had lots of questions and I wanted some answers. And Chris actually I really liked what he had to say about the live active culture seal and its value to consumers. So Chris, would you jump in and share those thoughts with them?
Yeah, I think, Andrew, to your point, a lot of us are trying to, as we go out, incorporate fermented foods into our diet. We know the importance of our gut microbiome. We hear about it in the news, and we're looking for ways to incorporate live cultures into our diet to have better gut health or digestive health. And this seal allows you to kind of know that you are getting live cultures in your yogurt. And to your point, they may or may not be probiotic, but it doesn't matter, because we are trying to cultivate our gut microbiota, and that live seal helps you do that. Something like a sauerkraut you showed a few slides ago, traditional sauerkraut is fermented and there'll be live and active cultures in there, but the kinds we sometimes can see in the store have been sterilized or pasteurized to remove most of this. That's not to say the sauerkraut itself isn't delicious, doesn't provide fiber and other nutrients, but you're not going to get the bacteria that you may be looking for.
And that's an important point, because in the media, we read a lot of eat pickles, eat sauerkraut. The problem is we're just buying the pickles off the shelf aren't going to get us those probiotics or the microorganisms.
Correct.
All right. So moving on to the next slide, we're going to take a look at the differences between pickling non-dairy foods, pickling of dairy foods, and fermentation in general. If you'd give me a slide adjustment over, that'd be great. So Okay, we're going to talk culinary for a minute. When we're talking about pickling or fermenting, here's another place where we can get confused, and it's because products can be pickled, fermented, or both. They can be fermented and pickled. And the devil is in the details here when it comes down to the process that's used to create the food, and it determines what potential health benefits could be or would be available. Now, the method matters, so the preservation to production. We're going to take a look at the left-hand slide and we're going to work our way to the right. Pickling of non-dairy foods. So pickling is not a ferment. Pickling the way we know it now is usually based on the quick pickling method. It's common in culinary. It's done at home and by food producers. And it's used to create the things that we see: dill pickles, sauerkraut, any pickled vegetables on the shelf. It involves heating a flavored vinegar, usually herbs, spices, salt, sugar, submerging the vegetables in that vinegar for a period of time or days. It allows for a quicker, more controlled production. It has consistent flavor because we can control it. There's a lot less time, and it's all of these things that a business model needs. Those are important. There's nothing bad about that. The heat used in this process actually softens and sort of cooks and changes the texture of the end product. The acid from the vinegar is what imparts the tang, and that's very different than in a ferment where the lactic acid is responsible. And the production almost always involves a pasteurization product to improve shelf stability. Now, that pasteurization product, without adding any back in of the microorganisms, means that this is not a probiotic or a live microorganism food. Now we take a look at fermentation of non-dairy foods. So this is an old method of preservation. This was before the quick pickling method, and it was used to preserve food. And as a quick tip, so that when we start to get the nuts and bolts, and if somebody's really educated on this, fermentation is considered a pickling method. So that's why there's a lot of confusion around this. And that's where also the similarities stop, because while fermentation is used to preserve foods, it's a survival model method. Salt is added to the vegetables. That salt causes water to purge out and creates its own brine. The vegetables sit within that brine, and the natural bacteria begin to grow. That natural brine and the pH controls those natural cultures, preventing the bad bacteria from growing too much and allowing the good bacteria to do their lactic acid production thing. That lactic acid production thing and the microbial growth there is what creates vitamins and minerals and changes the nutritional value of the food. It also changes the texture and the flavor and the color of the end product. Some examples of that would be things like kimchi, traditional sauerkraut, traditional pickles, natto, the fermented soybeans. Now let's talk about fermentation when it comes to dairy foods. Okay, so this is still fermentation, but it's not pickling. And we're going to use the term cultured as synonymous with fermentation, back and forth. So when you hear about dairy, you hear cultured, it's still talking about the fermentation process. So in this process of fermentation or culturing, the bacteria alters the characteristics of the raw dairy product. In this case, it would be milk going into yogurt. And in here, that growth of the microorganisms feeding on the nutrients, the sugar and the vitamins within the milk changes flavor, nutrient profile, as well as texture. The process of the production here determines how live cultures are delivered in the final product. What does that mean? Okay, so in real words, it means that we start with a raw milk cheese or a pasteurized product. We add the cultures. It creates the end product, the yogurt, the kefir, or the buttermilk. And now we have the addition of potential live cultures afterwards. So what does that mean? It means that live culture depends on how the product is finished. So here we just talked about the 3 different methods of pickling and fermentation that are often causing a lot of confusion around the food sources and probiotics. And on the next slide here, Chris, you're up as they advance this for us. And I know you've been waiting patiently, as with everybody else, to sort of get to the science behind why fermented dairy is really powerful. And so with that, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. As we alluded to a little earlier in our discussion, I think this interest in fermented foods is really in part come about because of our understanding now of the microbiota and what the microbiome means. I remember going through my undergrad and graduate nutrition classes, you kind of talk about digestion very black and white. Enzymes break down foods into their basic building blocks. The body absorbs, reassembles, move on to the next thing. And, now we're learning that, what is inside of the GI tract is its own almost organism, and own whole other organ for our body and in these bacteria. So, this is really taken off as people try to understand what is a healthy microbiota, what makes their microbiome healthy, is there good, bad bacteria. And to be honest, there's a lot we don't know still, but we do know that you see differences whether how you're birthed, whether you were vaginal or cesarean, breastfed versus formula, how much fiber you take in. Antibiotics obviously are going to upset the balance of your microbiota as well. And you see in disease states different levels of certain bacteria, and whether those are a cause or a consequence of the disease, we're still trying to elucidate. But we know that eating live foods with live cultures can be beneficial. Over 100 years ago, Eli Metchnikoff won the Nobel Prize for understanding that Bulgarian peasants who drank kind of a fermented yogurt type drink lived longer lives, and he linked that to digestive health. So we've known that eating fermented foods is linked to the microbiota. Now scientifically, we're just trying to fully understand why. So yeah, if you could help me advance the next slide, that'd be great. So in the next series of slides now, we'll transition from this kind of historical context to some of the specific studies and linking dairy to various health outcomes. Next. So, just to kind of ground us a little bit before diving into the fermented dairy literature, I have up on the slide cheese and yogurt, the two we're going to talk about primarily in this talk, all stem from milk. And you can see that all three foods are, provide 6 to 9 essential nutrients. And, each of these have, upwards of 15, 20 nutrients in them. The 6, 7, and 9 refer to the amount in terms of whether, they are good or excellent sources of a specific nutrient. So whether they meet that threshold of, they provide 10% of the daily value or upwards of 15 or 20% of the daily value. So you can see milk provides 9 essential nutrients. Yogurt and cheese, because of the processing, some of the, you're separating curds and whey in the cheese, and yogurt, you're concentrating and removing some liquid. You do lose some of those nutrients in that. And so you can see there's slight difference in the amount of nutrients provided. Now, that's not to say those are not nutrient-rich foods. They still are. It's just putting it up there that, each of these allow you to get a whole host of nutrients at a level that we need to kind of meet recommendations. Next slide, please. So because of the nutrient richness, and as we'll talk through today, the association between dairy foods and reduced chronic disease risk, over the last 15 years, the dietary guidelines for Americans have recommended 3 servings of dairy foods for adults, or kids and adolescents and adults 9 years and older. So, as I said, part of it is because of the slide before, to meet nutrient needs, and the other part is it's associated with reduced disease risk, which we're going to touch on in the upcoming slides. Okay, so now let's talk specifically about fermented dairy foods and some health outcomes. Now, I can't talk about everything. One, I don't want to put you or Andrew asleep. I get really excited about this stuff. I could talk about the studies for days. But in the interest of time, I can only show some. We have developed science summaries, and they're posted on the National Dairy Council website. So if you're more interested in a topic, these are great starting points to go out and kind of read. They're referenced. And so you have all the studies you can go back to and read for yourself if you kind of want to dig back into the original research and really form your own conclusions. I always encourage that. But we have ones on cheese and health, type 2 diabetes, yogurt and health, CBD, as you'll see in a little bit. So great resources on our website for those who are interested. So in terms of dairy and type 2 diabetes, there's been considerable research done, especially in the last 10 years, looking at this area. So I have up on the slide 2 different systematic reviews and meta-analyses that were conducted in the past few years. You can see on the left side of the screen, one from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, the other from PLOS One. And in both of these meta-analyses, you can see they looked at upwards of 400,000 participants. They were pooling from several different studies. So in these meta-analyses, these are really important because you are taking all the studies together and putting them and looking at all the individual data to see a trend and see if there's statistical significance amongst each of these different studies. So it gives you much more rigor and reproducibility and assurance that what you're seeing is kind of an association that you can maybe lean more towards being more cause and effect. So you can see in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, dairy intake was associated with a 7% reduction of type 2 diabetes risk. And in the PLOS One, very similar 6% reduction for each 200 gram serving of daily dairy. Try saying that a few times fast. Now, I don't get hung up on the amounts, because I think what you're looking for is consistency. So 2 different meta-analyses done by 2 different groups came to the same conclusion, that consuming dairy was associated with a reduced risk of disease. And I think that is important. We, as scientists, any of you know, have a really hard time saying anything is certain. We look for patterns, and when you see these patterns of multiple studies showing the same thing, you can feel a little more confident that those are the true biological effects. But in case you're wondering, 1 cup of fluid milk is a serving of milk is 245 grams. An ounce of cheese is a serving is 28 grams, and 1 6-ounce container of yogurt is 170 grams. So in the ACSM article, you can see it was 400 grams of total dairy. You could get your 3 servings into there, especially if it's a couple grams of cheese or 2 servings of cheese and a cup of milk, or a couple of cheese and a yogurt. The 200 grams was basically probably 1 cup of milk, a couple ounces of cheese and yogurt, all stuff that we can easily fit into our diet each day. And I think that's another key. We're not talking about amounts that are unrealistic to consume. These are well within the recommended amounts of dairy that you should be eating on a daily basis. So in terms of yogurt in particular, so moving away from total dairy and now into yogurt, you can see again consistency among 2 very large systematic reviews. Again, over 450,000 on the one on the left from BMC Medicine, which was done by a Harvard group, and then on the right you can see a different group that looked at 570,000 individuals, and in both you're seeing yogurt consumption associated with 14 to 17% risk reduction, and this is pretty substantial in terms of nutrition. You don't usually see this type of reduction of risk for one food. Now again, these are pooling cohort studies. There's limitations that go with observational data, but you can feel a little bit more confident again because you're seeing consistency among multiple studies by different groups showing the same results. Obviously clinical trials continue to be a gold standard, and we'll touch upon some clinical findings in a little bit. Now, on the next slide, one of the major drivers for diabetes is weight. And this study, which is a few years old now, looked at weight gain over 4 years in the nurses' health studies and the health professional follow-up studies. And most of you have probably heard a lot about these. The data Harvard used quite a bit. And they looked at weight gain over time, and you can see I circled where cheese and yogurt fit in. Cheese is pretty neutral in terms of weight gain over time, whereas yogurt is beneficially associated. But again, I think if you are thinking about just healthy eating and healthy eating patterns, and you look at cheese, vegetables, nuts, whole grains, fruits, yogurts, are all associated with lifestyles or eating patterns associated with less weight gain. And I don't think any of us should be surprised that the dairy, fruit, vegetables, whole grains fit into that. At the top, I just had lunch before this. I can tell you I ate Doritos. I don't feel bad about it. And I think none of us should feel bad about eating some potato chips or fries or unprocessed meat. Like anything, if you do it to extremes or you're not eating the proper serving sizes, I think that's where you start seeing some of the problems. But I think one of the things that'll come up over these next series of slides is these healthy eating patterns, which dairy and cheese and yogurt are a part of, are associated with better health outcomes, and this data clearly shows that. So we'll pivot now from type 2 diabetes and talk a little bit about CVD. Again, on our website, there's several science summaries if you're interested in reading more about any of these that I'm presenting today or any of the other studies that have come out over the years on this topic. Now, CVD is something we are keenly interested in when it comes to dairy because, dairy foods, whole milk, cheese, whole milk yogurts. Again, I'm a whole milk yogurt fan. I like the brands with the 2% or 5% fat in them. Other people can consume low fat. And I think that's one of the cool things about dairy. And Andrew, you'll touch upon this at the end a little bit, or probably in your culinary, right? There's a dairy for any recipe you want to fit in or anybody's lifestyle of what they want to eat. But the fat content in dairy foods can sometimes scare people away because they worry about, their risk for heart disease or, I know my mom in particular, she's a little overweight, is in her 70s now. And one of the things her doctors told her, to reduce her risk for disease is cut out, fat and reduce saturated fat. And really, I think, we're learning that just that blanket recommendation may not be best. It may be better to encourage certain foods and where you're getting that fat from. So in these next couple slides, we'll talk particularly about cheese because, I think with the fat and sodium in cheese, sometimes people believe that it's going to increase their risk of CVD when in fact, most of the evidence says it's either neutral or beneficial. Slide. Yeah, I guess, sorry, it's hard when I'm not controlling the slides. Yeah, there's been at least 10 systematic reviews, and this gets back to my point is I can't bore you with everything today. So, I'm going to talk about a few, but, you can see from the 8-year period of 2009 to 17, you're looking at just from an epidemiological perspective, 23 studies that have looked at fat and dairy fat and CVD, CHD, and stroke, and suggest it's not linked with higher risk for those conditions. So we'll start with a clinical trial here, and you can see in this study it was published in AJCN, took 139 people who had had 2 risk factors for metabolic syndrome, so either high triglycerides, blood pressure, abnormal glucose tolerance, among overweight, obese, and then they broke them down into 3 different groups, and they received for 12 weeks either regular 80 grams of cheese, which we saw is about 3 ounces, so 3 servings, a reduced fat cheese, and this was hard cheese in this study, or the control group that you can see it was like a bread jam kind of combination. So it had some calories from fat, but you can see there was 5% difference between the regular and the control. And what they found in this study is among these participants, these subjects, that the regular fat cheese compared to the reduced fat cheese compared to the control, there was no difference in total LDL or HDL cholesterol. So eating this cheese daily didn't increase your risk of, change any of the metabolic risk factors. It didn't make them worse. It didn't, LDL cholesterol didn't go up. You weren't seeing any indication that you would be at risk. Now, again, it's 12 weeks. So, whether this would continue long term, we don't know, and that's an area of research, but it does, most of us don't eat 3 ounces of cheese a day either for 12 weeks. So I think it's a pretty good study to show that weaving cheese into healthy eating patterns isn't going to make you keel over and have a heart attack right away. And this is true on the next slide. You'll see where we've done again a meta-analysis that will show. There we go. Shows that cheese consumption is associated with reduced CVD risk. So here again, we're pulling from 15 studies, 340,000 people, And you can just see in the figure that when you looked at all these different studies, there was a reduction in CVD, CHD, and stroke risk with cheese intakes. And you can see the little quote, the largest risk reductions observed at the consumption of approximately 40 grams per day. So about a serving of cheese. And again, that's pretty reasonable fitting into healthy eating patterns. So both clinical and observational evidence is suggesting that cheese can be part of healthy eating patterns. Now, if we move to hypertension, which is obviously a risk factor, we're back to using the nurses' health studies and the health professional follow-ups, and this study looked at long-term yogurt consumption and risk of incident hypertension. If you look at the green bars in the very back of the figure, that's looking at just increased yogurt intake from the lowest on the left, tertile 1, to the highest on the right, tertile 3. And you can see that, higher yogurt intake was associated with a lower risk of incident hypertension. And then when you combine that with DASH diet scores, the risk goes down to about 30%. So you have a 30% less risk of developing hypertension in this cohort if you ate yogurt regularly, which in this study was, you can see about 5 servings per week, with higher fruit, vegetable, whole grain eating patterns. Again, not a surprise to most of us, right? We understand what are healthy components of a diet, and when you put these all together, magic kind of happens. And whether it's a lifestyle or a combination of nutrients and the matrix of all these different foods coming together, you get this significant reduction of risk. Now, in that same cohort, we asked, the question was asked, what happens if the people already had hypertension at baseline? Was their risk of developing cardiovascular disease or stroke modified or affected by yogurt intake? And again, people who consume just greater than 2 servings per week of yogurt, especially in the context of a healthy diet, had a lower risk of developing CVD. I think what this points out is, one, there's not a whole lot of people that eat yogurt. We had to look at, you're looking at large cohorts, and you can only tease it apart to people who are eating, 2 to 5 servings per week. But 2, that yogurt is associated with better health benefits. So I think it's a good way to kind of weave yogurt into recipes or snacking. And again, I know, Andrew, you're chomping at the bit to kind of talk about this when I get through my science part. Now, lastly, I kind of want to touch a little bit about inflammation. Andrew led in earlier. Inflammation is one of those topics that's just coming up. You hear all the time about neighbors, friends, athletes, everybody trying to eat or not eat certain foods because their stomach is literally on fire and they have inflammation coming out of everywhere. From a dairy perspective, again, we hear often, I get questions a lot about, should I cut cheese, cut yogurt, cut dairy out of my diet because it's causing chronic inflammation. And chronic inflammation is nothing to, it is an important thing. We shouldn't discard it. It's associated with disease risk, but cutting yogurt or probably any healthy food group out or dairy out, like you wouldn't cut fruits and vegetables out, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And up on the screen, you can see, again, a systematic review, 52 clinical trials. So this isn't even observational evidence. This is clinical data. And in each of these, there was no association with dairy and increased inflammation. In a study that looked at yogurt intake, in particular in inflammation, it was found that consuming a serving and a half of yogurt per day for 9 weeks reduced biomarkers of inflammation and improved markers of gut integrity. So building up that barrier between the outside world, what's in our gut, and the inside of the body. And what's really cool about this study is this was, you can see at the very bottom, the yogurt was Yoplait low-fat yogurt. So this is things I give my kids for dessert because we know it has some added sugar into it. And, this isn't, these healthy foods can have some sugar, can have some fat to them and still maintain their health benefits. Now, is it possible that a lower sugar, higher protein yogurt may have even better effects? Absolutely. That would be a reasonable hypothesis. But, this study showed that just weaving in, 1.5 servings of just, tasty yogurt per day as a snack can really help your metabolic health.
You know, Chris, given the nature of our audience today, the ACSM, with the improved markers of gut integrity, with endurance sports and some high intensity sports, the ischemic nature of reducing the blood flow to the gut and causing that leaky gut syndrome, this is an important slide that while you can't eat dairy maybe before a workout or during, it sure should be used in the daily process of the diet leading up to the training.
For sure. Yeah, that's a great point. I didn't even think of that, but once you started saying it, I'm nodding. My wife's a marathoner, and I run. I'm not like her, but yeah, I know that, having seen her at the end of marathons, the toll that it can take on the body. So you're right this is a good way to kind of weave in, again, the nutrient package dairy provides, but now this benefit of getting the gut back to, back in order. And, having gastroenterologist doctor friends on ISAP, I've talked to them quite frequently about issues of antibiotics and this, and their go-to is yogurt as doctors. So I think it speaks to that a lot. So, just to kind of tie up some of this, because, we focus on what Andrew just brought up, the impact to the body. I've presented all this evidence on the nutrients, the health benefits, but something that's often overlooked is the healthcare cost savings or the impact to our wallet, right? You go to the doctor, you can see, what it costs to go there. And this study looked at just, in the UK, what happens if you just increase yogurt consumption by 100 grams? What would be the impact on reducing type 2 diabetes risk potentially? And then what would that look like in terms of healthcare cost savings? And you can see that just consuming one more cup of yogurt would save about 2.3 billion pounds in terms of diabetes cost savings. So again, this isn't really hard. If we think about healthy eating patterns, we know like the DASH eating pattern, the Mediterranean diet, the lacto-ovo vegetarian, the eating patterns in the dietary guidelines are all healthy. They're all associated with reduced disease risk. If we could make subtle changes to get there, we could improve our health, reduce healthcare costs, and really weaving in a yogurt or a cheese snack is a good way to do that. So, what is it about dairy that's magical? I don't think there's any hidden tricks here. I don't think, I'm not going to pull any rabbits out of the house. I think it's just a natural food. Milk, and then when it's fermented to yogurt or cheese, is a combination, as you can see on the screen, of protein, of lipids, of vitamins, minerals, of bioactives from the live and active cultures to having bacteria in them if it's a natural cheese or a brie or a yogurt in there. And that's really hard to replicate. It's that matrix is so unique that, pulling one out, pulling a vitamin out, vitamin D. Yeah, you can get vitamin D from a supplement, and sometimes we need to get it. I live in Chicago. Our temperature yesterday was like 8 degrees and it was snowing. I'm not getting any vitamin D from the sun. So, supplements are really key to that. But, when you can package some of this up into a yogurt and you can get multiple nutrients and the health benefits, it really can improve your overall health. And then for yogurt in particular, you can see, some of the things we've alluded to throughout this talk. Bioactive compounds, there's peptides, free amino acids, all the mojo that the bacteria do. There's increased concentrations of vitamins, there's live ferments that can get delivered to the GI tract. And, most importantly, there's a taste and texture that we just love about yogurt and cheese. I have 3 kids, and honestly, there are nights where, we make black bean burgers at home, and I think they're delicious. I just think they need some guacamole or whatever on top. But they like it with that cheese on top. That little ooey gooey, and it doesn't have to be a lot. And we're not smothering it, but that gets them to kind of eat that black bean burger and get some important kind of marriage of plant and dairy to kind of meet your nutrient needs. So with that, I'll turn it back to Andrew, and he can talk about some of these taste texture issues and how to kind of get yogurt and cheese into your diet in creative ways.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Every time I hear that science part, you think I'd zone out, but I don't. There's always these little bits and facts, and I'm like, you know what? People need to hear this stuff. So we really appreciate that aspect of it. And bringing it all together, fermented dairy foods do have a lot to offer. There's no doubt about it. And it's only nutritious if we eat it, though. And so the goal here is how do we incorporate this fermented type dairy foods or dairy foods into a healthier and sustainable diet? Safety and storage to minimize food waste is really big. We don't want to spend money on something and end up having to throw it away. There's some simple rules, and as a culinarian, I came up from the food background in the restaurants. Food safety is a really big issue. And there's a kind of a golden rule for us in restaurant, it's 4 hours. But with milk, it's a good household rule of about 2 hours. Don't leave milk, yogurt, or cheese out at room temperature for more than 2 hours. Realistically, we shouldn't leave it out for more than a few minutes. And the reason why is because we do have to minimize that bacterial growth. And on all of our food, there is bacteria, and keeping it cold slows that growth down. But just remember that 2 hour window is pretty easy. Cheese is interesting. Cheese flavor blooms. And I'm going to give you a culinary example here. If you were to pull an orange out of the refrigerator and smell it, it's not going to smell like a whole lot. But if you were to take it and then start rubbing it between your hands or on your arm to warm it up, it gets really aromatic. And the reason why is because the flavors in the oils are what being released. The same thing happens with the cheese because there's a lot of fat in cheese. And that fat carries flavor. That is like a culinary. Fat isn't flavor, fat carries flavor on the palate. And that's important to note. So when you're taking out a good cheese, you're gonna eat cheese. Letting it come to room temperature really will improve that flavor. However, with a cheese platter or a cheese tray at a party, if we leave it out too long, it will weep. So that oil will start to come out of the cheese, and that's not a positive benefit. So we wanna keep it as cold as possible most of the time. Now, when it comes to mold, the question is, should we eat it or should we not? With soft cheeses, the answer is no. That's like our camembert and our brie, because we have no way to tell where that mold actually is. There's not like this edge barrier we can cut off. So it's best just to get rid of that. With harder cheeses, though, you can cut about an inch, a little more, a little less off around the outside, and then re-wrap it with new plastic or new fresh wrap. That's important because those spores of mold will attach to the package. So don't just take it out of the old one and put it back in. You do want to replace that. And then freezing. Like, what do you do with cheese if you don't think you're going to eat it? And I'm going to talk about blocked cheese specifically. Softer cheeses like our Monterey's, our cheddars, provolones, anything that can be easily grated. If you think you're not going to get through it from a culinary perspective, we would shred it, pop it in freezer bags, label it, and put it in the refrigerator. It's going to be easier to defrost when it's shredded. Now, while the aged cheeses might become a little bit crumbly and you won't have that same nice gooey texture, or I want to say cheese texture after it's been frozen, this works amazing in dishes as toppings or as melted toppings, or using it as an ingredient recipe wise. So don't hesitate to grate those soft cheeses and freeze them and use them later as an ingredient. With yogurt, we're looking at a shelf life from 17 to 14 days. Of course, you can always tell when things go bad by simply the sniff test, taking a look at it. Does it smell right? Does it look right? And is there mold? I will tell you, one of the ways to keep yogurt better in your refrigerator is to make sure you scoop with either a spatula, a spoon, or a butter knife that top portion. So like when you get in to scoop it out, you always leave a little bit left over on the top. That will actually dry out and mold faster than if you were to remix it, reincorporate it back in. Storing your yogurt and your dairy is important. Keeping it out of the doors is the primary recommendation I use for homes. We know that in our refrigerator, the cold air is coming from the freezer, and that freezer, when you open up your refrigerator, you can see that vent. That air is being ported from the freezer. So you want to keep your dairy in the back. Sometimes that vent is located at the top of the shelf of the refrigerator. That's a good place to keep the items you want to keep particularly cold. The doors, because they open and they're exposed more to the ambient air, typically aren't as cold over time, especially if you have kids that are opening and staring all the time at something's going to appear in the refrigerator. The door's not the best. If the whey does separate from your yogurt, just mix it back in. It's nothing wrong. It's just the watery whey coming back out. Storage to minimize food waste. Now, this was an interesting slide for me because I had the pleasure of learning about cheese storage from Laurel Miller when I was in grad school. I was doing a project at the time I was working in a kitchen, and she is a co-author of Cheese for Dummies book. And I'm excited to share some of the really interesting and cool things that she enlightened me about cheese storage. So first, cheese is an evolving product. And I know there's like, is cheese an alive product? Is it a dead product? Well, there are some differences between cheeses, but I want to point out that all cheeses, regardless of if they're pasteurized or raw milk, It's an evolving product. And what that means is that cheese, when it's in your refrigerator, it needs to breathe. It has to retain moisture. Its flavor is going to change over time. And most importantly, the environment, like all of the other foods in the refrigerator, will affect the flavor of this cheese. It will transfer odors to and from, like a really stinky cheese, like a great blue vein cheese is going to add some flavor to unwrapped stuff in your refrigerator. So it's evolving, and we need to take care of it as such. So what does that mean exactly? So we do want to keep it cool in a refrigerator, 35 to 40 degrees. And the first thing you want to do is wrap your cheese in like a parchment or a wax paper if it's available. It provides a breathing layer. And then the second is to wrap the outer layer with plastic wrap or stick it inside a Tupperware with a lid. What that does is it retains the moisture, because your refrigerator is drier than a bone. It's like a freezing cold desert in there. That's why when you stick, it's a staler. If you stick something in the refrigerator, it dries out. And we don't want to dry out the moisture from the cheese. So we want to keep it covered, but we don't want to cover it so tightly that it can't breathe. Hence the wax paper and the breathing layer. Now, hard cheeses have a lower moisture content. Or hard cheeses would be things like Pecorino Romanos, Parmesans. They slow down bacteria growth simply because they don't have the water activity, that moisture, and they'll last a little bit longer. Hard rind cheeses, if you were to actually buy a whole wheel, which is really expensive and not many of us get a chance to do, that outer rind is a natural protectant. So for us consumers, we typically don't have that, because once it's been cut, we've exposed the center and it's no longer a protective layer. Fresh cheeses, things like buffalo mozzarella, fresh mozzarella, when they're packed in their brine, don't drain that. You actually want to maintain and store that cheese in the brine. The water keeps the moisture, and most importantly, that salted brine helps preserve itself from mold growth. It's an antimicrobial. And some myths that I learned is rubbing cheese with oil will not help preserve it at all. The type of milk used, whether it's cow, sheep, or goat, does not impact its shelf stability. And raw milk and pasteurized milks will keep for the same amount of time. Longevity is like cheese and longevity mixed together, is based on texture, whether or not it's hard or soft. So like I mentioned, the harder the cheeses, the kind that you would grate, like a Parmesan, is going to last a little bit longer. So quick tips for adding more fermented dairy to your plate. You know, we went over a ton of research. It's easy to reap the benefits of fermented food. Chris's slide showed that if we just eat, 3 to 6 ounces of yogurt, 1 ounce of cheese, and over a habitual, consistent diet, we don't have to eat it all in one day, but we need to get it consistently through. But there are a lot of other ways to add these dairy products, and we don't have to just eat plain yogurt or plain cheese. A couple things that I really like to do for breakfast is adding a Greek yogurt to a quinoa, like a savory quinoa and sweet potato bowl. So really it'd be quinoa, some roasted sweet potatoes, and some Greek yogurt with some Parmesan cheese. It's just a nice difference to breakfast than having the same old breakfast foods. Lunch and dinner, I am a huge fan, like the hugest fan, of using yogurt in place of mayonnaise for things like dressings, spreads, sauces, potato salads, and slaws. Yogurts will fit the bill every time. You don't have to have mayonnaise. And even if you want some of that mayonnaise, you can still do 50-50. It doesn't have to be all mayonnaise. I also like the additional protein that I get when I use a Greek yogurt as a base for something like a potato salad. Yogurt. All right. So among all of the initials, I do have some PhD envy, Chris. So I have a lot of initials at the end of my name. 3 of those are CEC, that stand for Certified Executive Chef. It means I took a test through the American Culinary Federation that kind of says, hey, I've been in the industry for a while. So based on that, I do have some culinary experience. And right now I want to take this to a culinary path. And yogurt is a culinary powerhouse. And I have that in big, bold letters on my notes. Because in culinary, we're always looking for like what ingredients are incredibly versatile and really easy to use. That's yogurt. It literally is a ready-made everything. From any ingredient standpoint, just simply add, like, how are you feeling today? Feeling savory, feeling sweet, feeling spicy? You mix it in and there's hundreds, if not thousands, of possible outcomes with one single yogurt as an ingredient base. The science behind flavor combinations is a bit of a fascination for me. It's like the science behind the chemical compounds that make foods pair well together, like peaches and basil. Why does that work? Asparagus and white wine. Why does that work? Why does cheese go with everything? Why does yogurt go with everything? You know what? Actually, the versatility of dairy is finally now being proven by the flavor sciences, and there are books written on this, but every chef from forever has known this, that dairy is incredibly versatile in the kitchen. You can do so many things with it, and some of the recipes that I created for NDC are going to show that off. So let's take a look at that. Cajun yogurt remoulade. So this one is like wow factor because of the capers. It's got a little bit of the spiciness from the Tabasco and the sweet paprika. It's awesome for a sandwich spread or a dip. And I tell you what, this just makes fish sing. You often see this like with catfish or fried catfish. You don't have to fry it. Baked, roasted, grilled. It's going to work for you really well. These bold flavors and that creamy mouthfeel make it finish in a very popular recipe. And when I say easy, I mean really easy. Even though I'm a chef and I have these skills, I'm not about spending hours in the kitchen. This one has 2 steps. If you take a look at that, there are 2 steps. Combine everything, let it sit, and be happy. And it's an awesome recipe. The avocado yogurt soup. Now, I didn't reinvent the wheel on this one. I made it very simple. It's cool, creamy, and refreshing, and incredibly easy. Essentially, if you can make a smoothie, which everyone can, you just throw the ingredients in the blender and get the right consistency, you can make this avocado yogurt soup. The buttermilk, it provides that tangy pop and livens up the fat from the avocado, but because the flavors from the milk, the buttermilk, and the avocado are soft, they're kind of muted. It really lets the herbs, the dill, and the mint stand out. Now, you can add all kinds of different things to this from a herb standpoint and make it your own. This keeps really well in the refrigerator for 1 or 2 days. I can't say enough in the summertime. It is winter now, but I would still say save this one. You're going to want to use it. Cucumber Raita. So this one I adapted from a good friend that I met this year. Her name is Vandana Chef. I just love her name, by the way. It's so regal. I want to say it all the time. My Indian table was the cookbook that she wrote, and I asked her, share with me one of your favorite yogurt recipes, and she gave me cucumber Raita. Now, I am a huge fan of this. It's incredibly popular, and it's very easy, and it's incredibly unassuming, meaning it's brilliant from a flavor standpoint because it shows off how well dairy pairs with all of these flavors mixed in. Like on the ingredient list, you see it's got chili peppers, mint, and cucumber. And those 3 mix well, but then it's used to balance out spicy flavors in Indian cuisine. So it just plays incredibly well with all different types of foods. And last is my smoked yogurt marinade. Again, this just tells the tale of how well dairy pairs with smoked foods. Absolutely it does. So one of the questions that I get all the time is why marinate in yogurt? So here's the thing. First, the fermentation process creates that lactic acid that we talked about, and that actually works to tenderize that very thin outer layer of the meat. Second, the sugars in the dairy, they caramelize. When they hit high heat, we know caramelization changes the flavor, and it adds a wonderful color. And third, there's that unique tanginess that we get from yogurt that the lactic acid provides, which just gives what we call restaurant flavor. It's that depth of flavor developed in your recipe that oftentimes home cooks can miss because they just didn't balance the ingredients appropriately. So bringing science to the table. If you're looking for more inspiration, there are more recipes, and you can find my recipes as well as others at the nationaldairycouncil.org site/recipes to bring more fermented dairy foods to the table. And with Chris's help, we've gone from history to research to recipes, and it is a lot of information. So let me review some of the key points here. Current dietary guidelines for Americans recommend 3 daily servings of dairy foods as part of a healthy diet pattern. And with Chris's slides, we saw that that was not difficult to get in. And with the recipes that I showed you, you can see how we can incorporate it even easier. Fermented dairy food consumption is on the rise and associated with lower risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, not inflammation, completely to the contrary. So that's good news. And emerging evidence suggests that a reduction in post-meal and chronic inflammation may be one of the mechanisms from the beneficial effects of dairy. Foods are more than just the sum of their individual nutrients. And I actually want to build on something that Chris said, that we can take supplements and vitamins, and yes, we can. But science is showing us now, even from something as simple as the apple, that we can see the microbial activity Those microbes that are inside the core of the apple that we didn't know existed are what makes that apple so much better as a whole food, not just, let's say, an apple supplement. And that's why dairy as a fermented food, it's the entirety of the food, not just the individual nutrient that gives us these benefits. So as we wrap up, I hope you do have a better understanding of fermented dairy foods. I know I do have from doing this series, even as a dietitian and a chef. For more evidence-based materials to ensure you have the latest on dairy's role in health and sustainable food systems, do visit the nationaldairycouncil.org. I do go here often and pull off great tidbits in science that I'm looking to talk about for presentations. And not only will you find the science summaries Chris mentioned, you'll find a whole host of other information that addresses the common questions about dairy from A to Z. And the National Dairy Council has done a great job of putting together comprehensive information to help get us informed about the product. The Dairy Nurses Network, I invite you to join that. As a member of the network, you receive quarterly newsletter from NDC, as well as a host of other resources, recipes, and opportunities. If you're not already a member of the Dairy Nurses Network, you can join through the post survey you're going to receive. And with that, we have some questions, I guess, Chris, and it's time for us to answer a few.
We are going to take today's questions from the webinar that were submitted, and we'll post the answers as a blog on the ACSM website at a later date. Thanks again to everyone for attending. Have a great afternoon. This concludes today's webinar.